It was the third week of January, in the northern range of Yellowstone National Park, and the Wapiti Lake pack had been moving south through fresh powder snow for the better part of an evening. The temperature at the valley floor had dropped to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. A frozen creek wound through the sage flats below Specimen Ridge, its banks thick with ice and dead bunchgrass bent sideways by the wind. The elk were there. 6 of them, pressed into a shallow depression in the hillside, burning calories they could barely afford to lose in the depth of a high-altitude winter. The wolves knew the elk were there. The GP's collar data would confirm it later, plotted against a topographic map in a research office in Mammoth Hot Springs. The pack's movement track showed a tight arc, a slow, deliberate approach curving down from the ridgeline above, the kind of geometry that any field biologist reading the data would recognize as a hunting sequence in progress. The pack had the wind working in their favor. They had the terrain. They had numbers. 6 elk huddled together in a hillside depression with nowhere fast to run. Then the location points on the map stopped advancing toward the elk. The wolves kept moving. They covered roughly 8 miles of timber and frozen benchland before the collar data ended for the night. But they moved north, away from the depression in the hillside, away from the elk. The reason appeared in the field notes the following morning. There was a designated backcountry campsite 312 yards from where the elk had been standing. 2 permitted hikers had used it the previous day. The fire ring held ash. The food storage cable, strung between 2 lodgepole pines, was still in place. The hikers were gone. The wolves came nowhere near the site. This would be a strange observation once. It is not strange once. It has been observed across multiple packs and multiple seasons, preserved in collar records and field notebooks accumulated by biologists who have spent more cumulative hours watching these animals than perhaps any other research team in the history of large predator science. And the question it raises has not been fully answered. Scientists studying it do not agree on the mechanism. The Yellowstone Wolf Project calls the behavior documented. It does not call it explained. The original wolves brought to Yellowstone in January of 1995 came from Alberta, Canada. They were captured across several locations in the province, loaded into steel shipping crates, transported south by vehicle and then by helicopter to the northern range of the park, and held in wire acclimation pens in the Lamar Valley for a period of weeks before the gates were opened. By the time the first pack moved out across an open meadow in the Lamar, without a fence between them and the horizon, the Yellowstone Wolf Project was already attaching radio telemetry collars to every animal it could safely capture. That equipment has grown more precise over the decades. The shift from VHF radio collars to GPE satellite collars in the early 2000s changed what researchers could see. A radio collar tells you roughly where an animal is when a biologist with a directional antenna is standing in the right location at the right time. A GPE's collar tells you where the animal was at programmed intervals every hour or every half hour across an entire year, whether anyone is watching or not. The data accumulates whether there is a researcher in the field or not, whether the park is full of summer visitors or buried under 3 feet of January snow. What that data showed, accumulated across years and multiple packs, became harder to set aside. The Junction Butte Pack, which has operated in the northern range for over a decade, shows a consistent pattern of reduced hunting activity in drainages within roughly a quarter mile of the Grand Loop Road during peak visitor season, approximately May through October. This would be unremarkable if elk avoided those areas during those months. They do not. Multiple independent research teams have documented Yellowstone elk using road corridors and the terrain near developed visitor infrastructure at rates significantly higher than random habitat use would predict. The prey is concentrated near the infrastructure. The wolves consistently do not hunt there. The Druid Peak Pack, the most intensively observed wolf pack in Yellowstone's recorded history before its dissolution in the early 2010s, showed similar avoidance behavior around heavily visited sites in the Lamar Valley. Field observers who spent thousands of hours stationed at roadside pullouts documented the pack rarely initiating hunts within visible range of the parking areas where tourists gathered with spotting scopes, even during seasons when bison calves, among the most vulnerable prey in the valley, grazed openly within that zone. One account from 2009, preserved in the Wolf Project's annual monitoring report, describes a pack of 8 wolves approaching a bison herd near a pullout on the northeast entrance road. The wolves slowed at roughly 500 yards. They circled wide, arcing north along a bench above the road. They sat on a ridgeline overlooking the scene for 43 minutes. Then they dispersed into the timber. No hunt was attempted. One account is an anecdote. 7 accounts form a pattern. The Wolf Project has documentation spanning 3 decades. To understand why this behavior sits inside scientific debate rather than settled explanation, it helps to understand what a gray wolf, Canis lupus, is actually capable of, and what its baseline behavior normally looks like. A gray wolf in Yellowstone is not an anxious animal. A fully grown male in the northern range will weigh between 90 and 130 pounds, carry jaws capable of exerting nearly 400 pounds of pressure per square inch, and leave tracks sinking 2 inches into spring mud with each stride. Wolf packs in Yellowstone maintain territories that can span 200 square miles of varied terrain, and the animals traverse that terrain regularly, moving through exposed meadows, crossing frozen lake edges, and navigating the thermal basin floors that no other large predator uses in winter. Wolves are also among the most cognitively sophisticated large predators documented in North America. The Yellowstone research record contains decades of evidence for problem-solving, spatial memory, and social learning in these animals. Packs transmit hunting strategies across generations. A behavioral pattern established by a dominant breeding pair can be expressed by their descendants years after those original individuals are gone. The learning is cultural in a meaningful sense. It moves through social bonds, not genetics alone. What the wolves do with that intelligence is not simply hunt. They read landscapes. They remember which terrain features favor a stalk and which expose them to prey that detects their approach. They adjust their hunting sequences based on experience with specific elk herds in specific locations during specific seasons. Biologists reading collar data from the same wolves across multiple years can often identify the point where a young animal's hunting behavior shifts from apprentice to practitioner. This is what makes the campsite avoidance pattern so difficult to dismiss as random variation. These are animals whose entire ecological identity is built around pressing terrain advantages and transmitting that knowledge across generations. When a pack with demonstrated access to prey-rich terrain consistently chooses not to use it, that choice does not read as accident. It reads as decision. Douglas Smith, who has led the Yellowstone Wolf Project since before the first wolf stepped out of an acclimation pen in January of 1995, has described the behavior in published interviews as one of the more genuinely puzzling patterns in the project's data record. The consistency is there. The why is not. The avoidance is not spread uniformly across the park's 3,471 square miles. It clusters around specific features of the human landscape, and it does so with enough regularity to allow researchers to begin mapping what they call behavioral buffer zones. Yellowstone's human infrastructure threads through the terrain in defined corridors, the Grand Loop Road connecting the major geyser basins and developed facilities, the Northeast Entrance Road through the Lamar Valley, the developed campgrounds at Canyon Village, Madison, Fishing Bridge, Bridge Bay, and Grant Village, and several dozen backcountry sites scattered through the interior wilderness. When researchers plot wolf GPS locations against these features, the result is not a park-wide depression in wolf activity. It is a localized one. The avoidance signal is strongest within a buffer of roughly 300 to 500 yards around active campsites and heavily trafficked pullouts. It diminishes as distance increases. At approximately a half mile from those sites, wolf movement frequency in the data begins approaching background levels for comparable terrain. Beyond a mile, the signal largely disappears. The park outside the buffer zones is used by wolves as intensively as terrain type and prey distribution would predict. The buffer zones are the exception. The seasonal component adds another layer of information. The avoidance pattern is measurably more pronounced during peak visitor months, when developed campgrounds hold their maximum occupancy and the road system carries tens of thousands of vehicles per day. It weakens in winter when backcountry sites sit empty and the Grand Loop Road is closed to private vehicles north of Mammoth Hot Springs. Some packs make winter use of terrain they appear to largely avoid during the visitor season, suggesting the behavior responds to current conditions rather than representing a fixed aversion to specific locations on the landscape. But the most striking geographic signal in the data involves timing. The buffer appears to persist around sites that held recent human presence, not just current occupation. A campsite empty at 2 in the morning registers differently in wolf movement data than terrain that has seen no human contact in several weeks. The ash ring in a backcountry fire pit is not a person. A sleeping bag left folded against a log is not a threat. A food storage cable is a piece of rope between 2 trees. And yet the avoidance behavior appears linked to their presence in ways that researchers are still working to characterize. How wolves detect the signature of recent human use at the distances the data suggests is itself an open question. Olfaction is the obvious candidate. A gray wolf's sense of smell operates at sensitivities estimated at roughly 14 times greater than a human nose, capable of distinguishing individual scent sources within complex mixtures at parts per billion concentrations. The residue of a campfire, the smell of synthetic insulation, trace cooking grease in the soil around a fire ring, these are plausible triggers. But the distances at which the behavior appears to activate, in some documented cases, suggest something beyond passive detection of a scent plume. Something that functions like active, extended avoidance. Here is where the puzzle deepens. Because the simplest explanation available fails on examination. The simplest explanation for wolves avoiding campsites is that prey animals are also absent from those areas, that elk and bison have learned to stay clear of human infrastructure, and that wolves following prey are simply tracking that absence. This would be a tidy answer. The data does not support it. Elk in Yellowstone are not absent from human corridors. Research examining elk distribution relative to roads and visitor infrastructure has documented that elk use those corridors at rates substantially higher than random habitat use would predict. The pattern has been recorded consistently enough that ecologists studying it have a name for the mechanism driving it. The concept is called the landscape of fear, a framework developed in the late 1990s to describe how prey animals map the psychological threat geography of their predators across physical terrain. In Yellowstone, that fear landscape has been bent in an unusual direction. The zones that represent maximum safety for wolves from human disturbance happen to coincide with zones of elevated risk for elk from wolf predation. And the zones where wolves suppress their hunting behavior, the human infrastructure corridors, have become zones of relative safety for elk. The prey animals have learned something. They appear to understand, through whatever mechanism of learning and cultural transmission operates in elk herds, that the terrain near roads and campsites carries lower predation risk. They are using human presence as a protective shield. This creates a paradox that sits at the center of the scientific disagreement about why the behavior occurs. If elk are more abundant near human infrastructure, and wolves are actively avoiding hunting in those same areas, then the wolves are consistently choosing to forgo hunting in terrain where prey density is actually higher than in the terrain they prefer to use. The avoidance cannot be explained as prey-following behavior, because prey availability does not predict it. Something else is operating, and that is where the scientific agreement ends. If you find this kind of question interesting, the kind that the data makes more complicated rather than clearer the longer you look at it, subscribe to this channel. The cases covered here are the ones that formal science has not yet closed. And if you have ever watched something move in the tree line in country you thought you knew well, drop in the comments and tell us where you were. The question of whether wolves are unusual in showing this behavior, or whether what Yellowstone researchers are documenting reflects something broader in the cognitive architecture of large predators, has a partial answer. They are not unusual. In the Santa Cruz Mountains of California, researchers with the Santa Cruz Puma Project, based out of the University of California, Santa Cruz, under the direction of Chris Wilmers, attached GPS collars to mountain lions hunting in a landscape bisected by suburban development and a dense network of hiking and mountain biking trails. The data showed that mountain lions in that landscape suppressed their movement and activity in areas near high-use recreation trails, with the suppression strongest during daylight hours when human activity on those trails was at its peak. The cougars shifted their hunting to terrain and time windows with less human presence, even when deer concentrations would have favored the more disturbed areas. The avoidance pattern in the GPS data bore a structural resemblance to what biologists in Yellowstone were documenting with wolves, a spatially organized buffer around human use zones, maintained consistently across individuals. In the boreal forests of Western Canada, research tracking wolverines documented consistent avoidance of high snowmobile use corridors during denning season. Wolverines are not social animals in any meaningful sense. They do not form packs. They do not transmit learned behavior through group culture. Each individual wolverine navigates its territory largely in solitude, acquiring behavioral patterns through its own experience and whatever genetic predispositions it carries. And yet the wolverines showed the same spatial aversion to human use corridors independently, without any mechanism for cultural transmission between individuals. The pattern appears across species with radically different social structures, cognitive architectures, and relationships with humans. Mountain lions that have occasionally been in conflict with hikers, wolverines that almost never encounter humans at all. Wolves with a centuries-long history of direct persecution, all of them showing variants of the same behavioral signature. What the wolverine findings do, alongside the mountain lion data and the Yellowstone wolf records, is suggest that this capacity for organizing spatial behavior around human presence may be less a learned cultural artifact in social species and more a widely distributed feature of large predator cognition. Something older than learning, something encoded in how these animals process risk across the landscapes they inhabit. Honesty requires saying plainly what the skeptics get right. The data from Yellowstone is consistent. The data is not proof of mechanism. GPS collar studies are constrained by sample size, and the number of wolves that can be safely captured and collared in any given period represents a fraction of the total park population. The behavior has been observed across multiple packs and multiple seasons, but no controlled experiment has isolated a single causal variable. Researchers looking at the same dataset have proposed competing explanations, and none of those explanations has been tested against the others in conditions that would let scientists separate them. The pattern is documented. The why remains genuinely open. The answer to why it happens comes in 3 parts, and not one of them requires the animal to be operating outside the range of what field evidence supports. The first explanation is direct response to human sensory signature. Wolves near campsites may register the acoustic, olfactory, and visual residue of recent human presence and respond with avoidance rooted in deeply established wariness. Gray wolves across North America were hunted, trapped, and poisoned for over a century before federal protections began to reshape that relationship in the latter half of the 20th century. The genetic legacy of that period, combined with learned avoidance transmitted through pack culture in the generations since the Yellowstone reintroduction, could produce consistent buffer behavior without any individual wolf in the current park population having experienced a direct negative encounter with a human. The fear is inherited. The behavioral expression of it is cultural. The two reinforce each other across generations. The second explanation operates at the level of prey behavior rather than predator perception. Elk and bison near campsites and road corridors are not simply more abundant. They appear, from the observational data, to be more vigilant. Ungulates near human infrastructure show higher alert posture rates, more frequent head-up scans, tighter flight responses, and smaller group spread. These are animals that have learned something about the edge of human territory, that unusual things happen there, that the normal rules of a predator-dominated landscape are suspended in that zone. Their elevated vigilance may make them dramatically harder to hunt successfully in those corridors, even when their raw density is higher. Wolves may be avoiding not the humans, but the version of the elk that lives near humans, an elk that has learned to be difficult to kill in exactly the terrain where wolves have learned not to press their advantage. The third explanation is the most difficult to test and, in some respects, the most interesting. It proposes that large predators in heavily monitored environments develop behavioral sensitivity not just to human physical presence, but to human monitoring pressure itself. Wolves in Yellowstone exist under an intensity of observation that has no parallel in the history of wild carnivore research. Researchers with telemetry receivers work the park daily during the field season. Tourists with spotting scopes line the pullouts at dawn. Camera traps are distributed across major travel corridors. Aerial surveys are conducted. The northern range of Yellowstone during visitor season is one of the most thoroughly observed landscapes on Earth. If wolves are sensitive not just to individual human beings but to the overall density of human attention in a given area, then the avoidance buffer may represent something cognitively richer than conditioned fear. It may represent a recognition that certain terrain is terrain where being seen carries consequences. Not enough to confirm. Not enough to dismiss. Return to the northern range. The third week of January. -22 degrees. The Wapiti Lake Pack moved 8 miles of frozen ridge and timbered benchland that night. Their tracks crossed a seasonal drainage east of Specimen Ridge, climbed through a lodgepole stand with snow packed hard between the trunks, and faded into terrain where the frost on the branches catches the first gray light of a Yellowstone winter dawn. The elk in the hillside depression survived the night. 6 animals burning through their fat reserves, not knowing why the pressure they had felt building from the north had suddenly turned and moved away. The GP's collar data preserving what the wolves did that night sits in a file in Mammoth Hot Springs alongside several 100,000 other location points collected over 3 decades. Those points together constitute the most detailed portrait of wild wolf behavior ever assembled in a single landscape. Researchers have spent careers reading that portrait. They have found in it the evidence of a behavioral pattern consistent enough to describe, specific enough to map against the terrain, and persistent enough to appear across packs separated by years and generation gaps. They have not found in it a single clean cause. The ash in the fire ring dispersed with the wind by afternoon of the following day. The tracks the wolves left in the snow across the northern bench filled with drifting crystals before sunrise. The elk were still in their depression when a park biologist passed on snowshoes 3 days later. What the Yellowstone wolves know about fire rings and food storage cables and the residue of where a human body stood, they have not shared with the researchers who have spent more time trying to understand them than any comparable effort in the history of American wildlife science. The behavior is there. The reason sits somewhere in the gap between the GP's data plotted on a topographic map and the actual moment on a frozen ridgeline when a pack of wolves made a decision that the data records but does not explain. The most dangerous predator in Yellowstone knows something. The question is, what else